Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Innistrad Crimson Vow spoilers. And I know, it's the weekend, but we still got a ton of sweet cards to talk about, which means we should probably jump right into it, start dogging sweet new Innistrad Crimson Vow cards. But before we do, a couple of quick reminders. Number one, if you want to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the weekend, we got them updated throughout the day over at MTGpreviews.com. Number two, if you need some cards that we talk about today, you can get them from our awesome sponsor Card Kingdom by heading over to cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Even get a free goldfish sticker. Just let them know that you'll want one in your order notes and they'll hook you up. So with that stuff out of the way, let's talk Innistrad Crimson Vow. So first up today, we have a pretty interesting mythic white enchantment in Hallowed Haunting. So Hallowed Haunting, 4-mana enchantment, says as long as you control 7 or more enchantments, creatures you control have flying and vigilance, and then whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you make a white spirit creature token. With this creature's power and toughness is equal to the number of spirits you control. So kind of this weird hybrid of spirit payoff if you have a bunch of enchantments in your deck, and also just an enchantress payoff. I think the easiest comparison for this is like a Sigil the Empty Thrones, an enchantress payoff that does see play all the way back to Legacy to some extent. Sigil the Empty Thrones, you cast an enchantment, you get a 4/4 angel. Hallowed Haunting, when it starts off in an enchantress deck, it's going to be a lot slower. You're only getting a 1/1, but as you make more spirits, they're going to get bigger and bigger, and eventually all those spirits can be bigger than the 4/4 angels that Sigil the Empty Throne makes. And then you also get this upside that once you get a bunch of enchantments, you get like a levitation plus Brave the Sands. The combination of flying and vigilance is pretty powerful. Flying lets you attack over your opponent's blockers and get in damage, and then vigilance means your spirits are also going to be back on defense, so you're not going to worry about dying on the crackback. So this is a powerful card. Like, if you can play a bunch of enchantments in your deck and cast a bunch of enchantments, Hallowed Haunting is a worthy payoff that can take over the game. As far as standard is concerned, I think the most immediate idea of this card is probably the Disturb deck. We see the new Disturb cards that are spirits on one side, enchantments on the other side. I think this is like the Mythic Disturb payoff, where essentially your front half is going to grow all your spirit tokens, and then when you disturb the enchantment parts back into play, you're getting spirit tokens that are going to be bigger than 1/1s, hopefully because you might have some spirits on the battlefield already. So I think that's kind of like level 1. If you want to build the Disturb deck in standard, this is probably a great payoff on the top end of your curve. There's other possibilities though. You don't got to be a spirit deck, you don't got to be a Disturb deck. We've seen some weird like Rune Storm decks in standard where you're trying to just like chain together Rune of Sustenance and Rune of Speed and Rune of Might, maybe with Goldspan Dragon out, which makes mana when you target it with a rune, and then you can cast another rune. If you throw a Hallowed Haunting into the mix, it gets really crazy. You're going to be making so many spirits, and this is probably more like a janky fun against the odds deck still, but really this is a really solid payoff for the Runestorm style deck. Maybe my favorite synergy for this card though is Rite of Harmony and then enchantments that make creatures. We have a bunch of them thanks to all the sagas in standard, like Ranger's Class makes a wolf token, Battle Bertagard makes different 1/1 tokens, Furge's Retribution makes a 4/4 angel, Skeletal Swarm makes skeletons each turn. If you can get this set up, like imagine playing Hallowed Haunting and then Rite of Harmony and then just casting a Ranger Class. You cast Ranger Class, you're going to make a spirit with Hallowed Haunting, which is going to trigger Rite of Harmony to draw a card. Then Ranger Class is going to come into play. That's an enchantment, so you draw a card. Then you get the wolf token, which will also trigger Rite of Harmony to draw a card. So once you get this set up, like essentially a single Ranger Class is going to be make a spirit, make a wolf, and draw 3 cards. And then you can potentially out of those 3 cards play another Ranger Class or a Battle for Bertagard and kind of just snowball. And then since Rite of Harmony has flashback, you can potentially do it again the next turn. So there might be some wacky sort of creature saga enchantress style deck that we can build in standard. I don't know if this deck's going to be good, but I'm excited to try it because it looks ridiculously fun. Also, I think this could be a plant for the future to some extent. Yes, it is a Disturb payoff. Yes, we have pieces to make it work now, but remember, we're heading to Kamigawa. That's the next set release, and spirits are like the most plentiful tribe in Kamigawa traditionally, so who knows, maybe it'll be different this time, but I think it's a pretty safe bet that once we go to Kamigawa, we're going to see a bunch of spirits again, and then Hallowed Haunting might make even more sense as this weird spirit tribal type payoff. As far as older formats, things get pretty interesting. On one hand, thanks to Modern Horizons 2 and like Jumpstart Historic Horizons, we got cards like Sethis, Enchantress's Presence, Sanctum Weaver in Historic, in Modern, and we've seen Enchantress decks in those formats formats get much, much better recently. Could these decks want Hallowed Haunting? I think the answer is maybe. The thing is, when you compare Hallowed Haunting to Sigil of Empty Thrones in older formats, in Standard, there's no comparison because there's no Sigil Empty Throne, but if you go back to older formats, when you think about how this is going to work, let's say you're playing Enchantress, you cast your first enchantment, Hallowed Haunting is giving you a 1/1, Sigil of the Empty Throne is giving you a 4/4. You cast your second one, suddenly you have two 2/2s with Hallowed Haunting, you have two 4/4s with Sigil of the Empty Throne. If you add all this together, it's the 5th creature you make with Hallowed Haunting that is actually going to outpace Sigil of the Empty Throne. The first 1, 2, 3, Sigil of the Empty Throne is better. Number 4, they're equal because your spirits are all going to be 4/4, Sigil of the Empty Throne also is 4/4s. And then your 5th one is where the spirits are bigger. The other thing is Sigil's creatures have flying right away. Hallowed Haunting doesn't get flying until you get to 7 enchantments, which in an enchantress deck probably isn't a huge deal. Like, you should get 7 enchantments on the battlefield pretty quickly. But I think in older formats, my guess would be most decks will stick with Sigil of the Empty Throne. And even worse, a lot of decks have been cutting Sigil of the Empty Throne. It's kind of fallen out of favor as a finisher in enchantress decks because Destiny Spinner has proven to be such a good finisher in those decks. Now that we have the big mana production of things like Sanctum Weaver, so Sigil isn't even that much of a staple anymore in enchantress decks, even though it shows up on occasion. I do think, though, this card is certainly a staple in enchantress decks in Commander. In Commander, Sigil of the Empty Throne is an ultra staple. It's one of the finishers in essentially every style of enchantress decks, from Sethis to Daxos to Estrid to Gen. If you're playing enchantress, you're probably playing Sigil of the Empty Throne. I think the Hallowed Haunting is going to be the same deal, so I think this is just a new auto-include in every enchantress Commander deck as a second copy of Sigil of the Empty Throne that does have some upside. If you can snowball hard enough, it can be even better than Sigil of the Empty Throne. So Hallowed Haunting, I really like this card. I think it has some competitive applications in Standard. It definitely has some jank applications that I'm really excited about in Standard. It's got some potential for the future once we get to Kamigawa and theoretically get more spirits, and it's probably going to be a new Commander staple as well. I would not be surprised if this card ended up being pretty expensive, especially if it does see some play in Standard. We've seen in the past that cards that are staples in Commander and also decent in Standard, those are the mythics end up being like $40 or whatever. So I wouldn't be surprised if when we look back on Innistrad Crimson Vow in the future, that Hallowed Haunting ends up being one of the more expensive cards from the set. We also got Path of Peril, a pretty interesting new black removal spell. So 3 mana, destroy all creatures with mana value 2 or less, cleave of 6 mana in the Orzhov colors, destroy all creatures. So the first thing I thought of when I saw this card is this is kind of like the standard version of Dam. We got Dam in Modern Horizons 2, 2 mana, destroy a creature, 4 mana, you get a Wrath of God. Path of Peril's kind of similar but balanced for Standard, giving you this sweeper for cheap creatures for 3 mana, and then if you get up to 6 mana, you can just blow up everything. I think this has potential to be a powerful card. You essentially get a pseudo infest. I couldn't find a card that's actually destroy all creatures, mana value 2 or less. We got like Ritual of Soot that's 3 or less. Probably the closest comparison is something like Infest that just gives everything -2/-2, and then you get an overcosted Damnation or Wrath of God once you get to 6 mana. But I think this flexibility is pretty important. If you think about what this does in Standard, I think the main way to evaluate this is how good is a 3 mana cost. Like, that's what's going to determine if this card can show up in main decks. Is the 3 mana destroy all creatures mana value 2 or less good enough to play in your main deck? Otherwise, this might be a sideboard card, and the answer is it's pretty matchup dependent. I think where Path of Peril is at its best is blowing up tokens. All tokens have mana value 2 or less, or in general, there's some weird exceptions to the rule, but normally tokens have no mana value. So your Clarion Spear tokens, Sedgemoor Witch tokens, Azeka's Chariots tokens, Path of Peril is going to clean all those up for 3 mana. Also, really good against Mono White. Against Mono White, it hits essentially all the important creatures. You miss out on a couple of 3 drops, but really a huge percentage of Mono White's creatures die to 3 mana mode of Path of Peril, and it's surprisingly good against Mono Green too. Even though Mono Green only has a couple of actual creatures that cost mana value 2 or less, when you consider Ranger class, Azeka's Chariot tokens, Renin 7 tokens, Path of Peril actually hits a big percentage of that deck as well. So really good against Mono White, really good against Mono Green. The problem is much less good against the Izzet decks, where some of those decks have no creatures and it will do nothing. Other decks, like the Dragon builds, might have Smoldering Egg, but still Path of Peril just to kill a Smoldering Egg isn't especially exciting. So it might end up being more of a sideboard card just because of the swinginess of the matchups. If we end up in a meta where decks like mono green and mono white are the most played decks in the format, then I think you can certainly path to Peril in your main deck. For now, with Izzet being so popular, I think this is probably a sideboard card that you bring in the good matchups, leave on the sidelines in the bad matchups. The other question is there an Orzhov deck to take advantage of this? Like, you really want to be Orzhov because you do want to be able to pay that cleave cost. Orzhov isn't a super popular color combination right now in Standard, but maybe cleave will help change that. It is a powerful effect, and when you add in stuff like Vanishing Verves and Kaya, it's looking even better. So I like Path to Peril quite a bit. I'm not sure it can be a main deck card, but the flexibility is huge. In its good matchups, this can be a game-ending effect, even for 3 mana, and then having the upside of maybe wrathing the whole board later in the game is a really big deal. So whether or not this can show up in main decks is going to depend on the meta, but certainly a card to keep in mind. At worst, a potential sideboard all-star to deal with the creature aggro decks. At best, maybe it slips into the main deck if Izzet becomes less popular. Next up, we have the return of Halana and Alena. Halana and Alena Partners, a 4-mana Gruul legend. You get a 2/3 human ranger with first strike and reach, and then at the beginning of combat on your turn, put X +1/+1 counters on another target creature, where X is Halana and Alena's power, and that creature gains haste until end of turn. So this card is pretty interesting. On its face, it's a little overcosted. I mean, it's a 4-mana 2/3, not really exciting stats, but when you consider its ability to give its power to something else right away, and potentially giving a creature haste, it kind of reminds me a little bit of Surrak the Huntcaller, which was a card that saw a lot of play. Downside is, Surrak can just haste up itself and smash you for 5. Halana and Alena can't do that, but it is a way to add a lot of power to the battlefield. If you have a dork on the battlefield the turn this comes into play, you're essentially getting Siege Rhino stats. You're getting 2 power and 2 toughness on another creature, plus you're getting a 2/3 with first strike and reach, and it has potential to snowball as the turns go along. Every turn this stays on the battlefield, you're adding more counters to something else based on its power. So I'm imagining you play this in some sort of Gruul deck with like Prosperous Innkeeper, Tangled Furrowheater, and Ranger class, and you hopefully have one of these dorks down. You play Alena, immediately pump your Innkeeper, can attack with a 3/3, and you have this powerful value engine on the battlefield for future turns, and in future turns it gets even more exciting. The first turn, you're probably not going to get much value out of haste because you're probably going to spend all your mana to play Halana and Alena. However, the next turn, you can play a Shaya or a Battle Mammoth or a Wrenn and 7 and make a huge token, dump your counters onto that big threat, and give it haste and just smash your opponent for a ton. So if this survives for 2 turns, it's a really powerful threat on the battlefield. It's also really cute with pump spells. I think that's the main way to play this card, because remember, it gives another creature +1/+1 counters equal to its power, which means if you can use Blizzard Brawl or Fortifying Draw or like Lunar Frenzy or Exponential Growth or Unnatural Growth to pump Halana and Alena, you essentially turn these temporary pump effects into a permanent pump effect, because the other creature is going to keep those counters forever. So you play your Halana and Alena, then you, the next turn, Lunar Frenzy for all your mana to make Halana and Alena big. You get this huge creature for 1 turn, and then you get a ridiculous amount of counters on another creature, and those counters are going to stick around. So I think that's kind of the play pattern that this is going for. I will say, I don't know how good this is going to be in Standard. Not because it's lacking in power. I think that Halana and Alena is a powerful card, and we talked about all the ways that it can be really powerful. At the same time, it is kind of competing with like Azeka's Chariot in the 4-drop slot, with Moonveil Regent in the 4-drop slot, with Toski in some decks in the 4-drop slot. The upside of it sticking around and kind of just taking over the game is huge, but all of these cards, in some way or another, offer more immediate value that is more resilient to removal. Like your Azeka's Chariot, you get the tokens. If it dies, they stick around. Toski, indestructible, gonna draw you cards right away. Moonveil Regent, gonna deal some damage when it dies, probably. But Halana and Alena, sure, like if you make it to combat, you get the counters on something, which is nice. So you are getting some value, but it's less immediate value than a lot of the other options in the slot. So it might just be that it's good, but not quite as good as some of the other options in the format. I do think it's a really interesting commander to build around, though. In Commander, I think you go heavy on the pump spell plan, and you're trying to like Invigorate and then Berserk and make Halana and Alena huge, and then dump all those counters on an Inkmoth Nexus and one-shot someone, or some sort of double-striking Terrampling creature like Prophetic Flame Speaker that's probably going to one-shot someone, and then maybe you one-shot someone with Commander damage too with Halana and Alena, and just like take out 2 people really, really quickly. So I think it's a really cool build around for Commander. I imagine you're always going to want this in your command zone, and in the command command zone, it's going to incentivize you to play a lot of cards that most other decks aren't going to play. This weird sort of pump spell Voltron play pattern, which I think is going to be really neat. So I like Halana and Alena. The question is, can it beat out the other options in Standard? I think it has some chance, probably as a 1 of or a 2 of, but there are a lot of powerful 4-drops running around in our current Standard format. Worst case, it's a really cool commander that cares about things that are different than most other commanders, this weird pump spell Voltron style deck that I think is going to be really neat to build around. We also got a new transform card in Covering Curtains. So Covering Curtains front side, 1 mana 0/4 wall with Defender. You can pay 3 at sorcery speed to transform it into Uncovering Eye. Uncovering Eye, a 3/4 with Menace that when it transforms, you Thoughtseize an opponent, and if you take a card, they discard it and then get to draw a card to replace it. So I think Covering Curtains, Uncovering Eye, the flavor is kind of cool, but I think this card's really not that good. So it starts off as a 0/4, which I guess is a fine blocker, and then it flips into a Thrashing Brontodon, and then you get like a bad looting version of Thoughtseize when it flips. I don't think it would be too overpowered if this straight up Thoughtseize. Like when you consider you gotta pay 1 mana to cast it, and then 3 mana to flip it at sorcery speed, and your reward is a 3/4 menace that makes your opponent loot, and you get to take their best card, but they draw another card, kind of Vendilion Click style. I don't actually think this card is going to be all that strong in Standard. I don't know, maybe it's better than I think. Maybe it could be some sort of like smoldering egg for a black deck where you just play this and it gives you some defense in the early game and eventually flips into something more powerful. It is a decent blocker against some aggro decks, although honestly a lot of decks have 4-power creatures. Even mono white is good at growing their creatures, so I don't know how long a 0/4 is going to hold up on defense, but there's a couple of big problems with this card. One is black's got Eye Twitch, black's got Shambling Gas. They have proven to be very strong in Standard, especially since black has all these sacrifice synergies. It's hard for me to imagine Covering Curtains beating out an Eye Twitch or a Shambling Guest in the 1-drop slot. The other issue is, since you gotta transform this at sorcery speed, the blowout potential is fairly high. You like spend your turn trying to flip this, and your opponent in response to the activation Fading Hopes. You get nothing, and you're back to having a 0/4 once you recast it, and you gotta pay 3 mana again to try to flip it. Same with like Divide by Zero, Dragonfire, Fateful Absence. So you can't really control this flip in a way, and because it costs a decent amount of mana to transform it, it's going to be very, very risky in a lot of matchups. And the backside payoff, while it's fine, it's not insane. Like, it's reasonable. So I don't know. I'm not super high on Covering Curtains. Maybe I'm underrating the fact that you just go turn 1, play this, turn 3, YOLO, flip it, Vendilion Click, you get a 3/4. Maybe that's going to be better than I'm giving it credit for. But for now, I think probably be sticking with the Eye Twitches, sticking with the Shambling Gas in the 1-drop slot of my black decks, even though it is a cool design and it's sweet to see an Eye Horror making its return to Magic. Next up, we got the return of Geralf as Geralf Visionary Stitcher. So 3 mana 1/4 blue legendary human wizard. It gives zombies you control flying, and then you can pay 1 blue, tap it, sack a non-token creature to make an XX blue zombie creature token, where X is the sacrifice creature's toughness. So Geralf, this card is pretty interesting. It reminds me a little bit of Ghoul Color Gisa. Actually, Gisa lets you sack creatures to make a bunch of 2/2s equal to the sacrifice creature's power. Geralf kind of does the opposite. Rather than making a bunch of small creatures based on power, it makes one big creature based on toughness, but it is kind of the other side of Ghoul Color Gisa. We also see the zombies having flying ability, which is something we got in our last commander decks, actually. With Horde Wingscop, it is a powerful ability if you're playing a zombie deck, being able to just send your creatures to the air, swing in, kill your opponent. So when I first read Geralf, I thought, oh wow, this is the card we need to make decay zombies good. Like, it gives the decay zombies flying, so you can swing in and actually hit your opponent with them before they die, and I can sacrifice them to like make a real zombie token. That would be kind of sweet. The problem is that doesn't actually work. Geralf only sacrifices non-token creatures, so you can't actually do the trick of sacrificing decay zombies. It's still probably fine in a decay style deck. It does work with Gisa Glorious Resurrector, so that is an upside. Maybe you steal your opponent's creatures and then sacrifice them and turn them into zombies, but it's not as good with decay as I was hoping it would be. On the other hand, it does seem kind of sweet in a zombie deck. Like, you can sacrifice a random zombie to get another zombie to grow your champion of the parish or trigger your Archghoul of Thraben. Plus, zombies have cards like Even Death Dracolich, which come back from the graveyard, or Narfi that come back from the graveyard. You're not making massive tokens with them, but still, that is a cool synergy, and it is supporting your zombies dying, which a lot of zombies want anyway. So this could be an important piece of a zombie deck. Plus, sending your champion of the parish to the air or your Archghoul of Thraben to the air is really frightening. Like, that's going to help you close out the game so much much quicker through blockers. The other way to go with this card is just try to sacrifice high toughness stuff. Like, imagine playing Geralf and then the next turn playing a Cherix and then sacrificing it. You're getting a 17/17 zombie token for sacrificing your 4-mana Cherix. Or maybe you sack Demogoth Titan and get a 10/10. Or you can go with the cheap high toughness plan. Like we just talked about Covering Curtains or maybe Secret Door, these 1-mana 0/4s. They don't have any power, so they're not going to kill anything or your opponent or their creatures. But if you can sacrifice to Geralf, you can get a 4/4 for essentially 2 mana, 1 to cast a spell, another to sacrifice. And that 4/4 is going to have flying since it's a zombie. So there are a few different ways to potentially build around this in Standard. I think it's got a shot in zombies. Plus, you can definitely build around the ability with high toughness stuff. I also think this is going to be a pretty popular card for the 99 of various zombie decks. I don't think this is a great commander. Mono blue is a weird color for zombies and for sacrifice synergies, but if you're playing another zombie deck, I think this is a great option to include in the 99 because zombies care about sacrificing stuff anyway. It's not restricted to sorcery speed, so you can sacrifice a creature that's going to die to removal anyway, get some extra value out of it, and then because so many zombie commanders care about things going in and out of the graveyard, it's kind of naturally supportive, plus giving all your zombies flying can let you one-shot people potentially with a big board. As far as actually playing this as your commander, the best I could think of, a couple of options. I don't think they're great options, but it could be a good leader for some sort of mono blue Embalm and Turtleize style deck. The Embalm and Turtleize cards are not zombies, but when they come back from the graveyard, they are zombies. So you can sacrifice your Champion of Wits or Glyph Keeper or whatever your Vizier of Many Faces is copying, get a big token, and then get the creature back from the graveyard. You could also try to build like mono blue sacrifice. Sacrificing and death triggers isn't really one of blue's strengths, but there are a few options. Like Kiga is a pretty sweet card to sacrifice. Sacrifice it, steal a creature, get a 5/5, or like Reefworms or Thought Sponges. So there are possibilities. So it's kind of a janky build around commander that also offers some sweet support for zombies, although not so much for decay zombies in Standard. We also got Investigator's Journal, a 2-mana clue artifact that says it enters a battlefield with a number of suspect counters equal to the greatest number of creatures a player controls. You can pay to remove a counter, draw a card. You can pay to sacrifice it to draw a card, because obviously it's a clue and that's what clues can do. So Investigator's Journal, I think it's like a bad Maze Mind's Tome. I mean, I don't think it's a horrible card, and it can serve a purpose similar to Maze Mind's Tome, where you play this artifact that can draw you some cards. The problem is, Maze Mind's Tome, part of its power is you can run it out on turn 2, and then use it when you have the mana available throughout the game. Investigator's Journal, because it triggers based on how many creatures someone has, is not going to be very good on turn 2. Like, best case scenario, your opponent goes 1-drop, 2-drop, and you're on the draw, and you play this and you get 2 counters on it, and then you can sacrifice it to itself. In the best case scenario, it's not going to do what Maze Mind's Tome does. It is sweet in the late game when the board gets really big. Maybe you get a ton of counters on it, but in the late game, how many turns is the game going to go for you to remove counters to draw cards? So I think in general, it's a power down Maze Mind's Tome. Not that it won't have a role in Standard, but I don't think it's as good as past versions to this effect. What is interesting about this card is there are some cards, not in Standard, but in Commander and older formats that you care about clues being sacrificed. And Investigator's Journal is a clue, so you can sacrifice it to trigger your Throw Investigation, or sacrifice it to Lannis, or make a token with Uvenwald Mysteries, which is kind of fun for a Commander deck. It is colorless, so no matter what color of clue deck you're playing, you can play this as a support piece. The other places might have a role is in Commander decks that are bad at drawing cards. In Commander, you got 3 opponents, plus yourself. Someone's probably going to have a bunch of creatures in the mid game. You can play this, hopefully get 4 or 5 counters, and then every turn just draw an extra card for 2 mana. So maybe this can show up as card draw in mono white. So Investigator's Journal, it's fine. It's a cool flavor card. Not sure how good it'll be in Standard. I think the restriction of needing someone to have a lot of creatures to draw you a lot of cards is going to be a bit of a problem, just because you really want to play cards like this early in the game, like we were talking about with Maze Mind's Tome. But in Commander, especially in clue decks, Investigator's Journal is pretty sweet. Finally today, in the realm of lower rarity cards, we got a couple of good ones, starting with Archghoul of Thraben. So a 3-mana 3/2 zombie cleric that whenever it or another zombie you control dies, you get to look at the top card of your library. If it's a zombie, you can reveal it and put it in your hand. If you don't, you can put the card in your graveyard if you want to. So kind of a super surveil. When a zombie dies, you super surveil. You can put the card in your hand if it's a zombie. Otherwise, you get to choose. Leave it on top of my deck, put it in my graveyard. I think that's a pretty powerful effect for a zombie deck. It's kind of like a watered down standard Undead Augur to some extent. Drawing you a card, maybe when a zombie dies. And one of the things I like about this is this does not have the non-token clause. So if you're playing some sort of decay zombie deck, you can attack with your decay zombies, sacrifice your decay zombies, and get a bunch of Archghoul triggers. The only downside is some of the cards that make decay zombies, like Jadar, are not technically zombies, so you can't draw them with Archghoul, but still you can find more tainted adversaries. You can fill your graveyard, which is an upside in a zombie deck in standard. Zombies have cards they'd rather have in their graveyard. You want to have Narfi in your graveyard, it comes back cheaper. You want to have creatures in your graveyard for Ludovic to eat. You want to fill your graveyard for Corpse Cobble or Ghoul Caller's Harvest. So even just milling over cards in some cases can be a pretty big upside of Archghoul of Thraben. Plus, if you go back to older formats like Commander, Archghoul of Thraben I think is kind of just a new auto include in those decks. Zombies have aristocrat synergies, they have flashback synergies, they have sacrifice synergies. This seems like the exact kind of zombie you just want sitting on your board. If the board gets Wrath, you get some card advantage. If you have your Carrion Feeder Gravecrawler loop, you can potentially draw a bunch of zombies. So I think that this is a sweet card for standard zombies, probably not good enough for like modern zombies or historic zombies, but definitely an auto include in most zombie decks in Commander, because zombies care about what Archghoul of Thraben cares about, which is card advantage, graveyard shenanigans. So really a perfect uncommon for zombies. We also got, speaking of low rarity zombies, Mindleech Ghoul. So a 2-mana 2/2 zombie. It has exploit, so you can sacrifice the creature when it comes into play. If you exploit, you get to have each opponent exile a card from their hand. So Mindleech Ghoul I think is actually going to be really good in standard. It compares to Bugler Rats, Acquisitions Expert, these 2-drops that make your opponent discard a card when they come into play. The upside of Mindleech Ghoul is it's a 2/2 for 2, so you get an extra power compared to past versions. The downside is you need to be able to exploit if you want to get the discard trigger. The good news is black decks are all about sacrificing 1-drops. We've talked about this many times throughout spoiler season, but kind of the core of most black decks are things like Eye Twitch, things like Shambling Ghast. So you have this easy curve of like turn 1 Eye Twitch, turn 2 Mindleech Ghoul, make your discard, sack my Eye Twitch, tutor up a lesson from my sideboard, or turn 1 Shambling Ghast, turn 2 Mindleech Ghoul, make you discard, get a treasure token, or kill something else. So I think that with the right synergies in the right deck, because our standard format is all about these black sacrificeable 1-drops, Mindleech Ghoul can actually be very, very powerful and probably even better than cards like Bugler Rats and Acquisitions Expert. Otherwise, we got a few flip cards, mostly Limited Father, although Biolume Egg is kind of worth keeping in mind. I don't think it'll make it in Constructed. 3-mana 0/4 that when it's sacrificed, returns transformed is a 4/4 where you can sack 2 islands to make it unblockable. Maybe there's some sort of like Edict style deck or sacrifice synergy deck that can take advantage of it, but really it's only a 4/4 for 3, which I know that's a pretty reasonable body, but it's not like you're getting some way above the curve payoff. Like a 4/4 for 3 is fine, especially fine for blue, but when you consider you got to go through the work of sacrificing it, I don't know if that's going to be enough for Constructed or not, but worth keeping in mind for Limited at a very least. And anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Innistrad Crimson Vows spoilers for today. So let me know what you think. What card from today are you most excited about? Let me know in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and I will be back, well, maybe tomorrow. We'll see how many spoilers we get over the weekend, but definitely Monday with more daily Innistrad Crimson Vows spoilers. So until then, everyone, have an amazing weekend, and I will talk to you soon.
Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.